a landscape where entire towns vanished in a single week. In the far reaches of northern Norway, the winter of 1944 carried a silence that was not natural. It was the quiet of places where buildings had been burned, boats sunk, and roads blasted apart. When Finland signed its armistice with the Soviet Union in September, the German 20th Mountain Army began its long retreat through Lapland. What followed was a military withdrawal that would reshape an entire region for decades. As German columns moved westward, orders from General Lothar Rendulic transformed strategic caution into systematic destruction. The aim, according to those orders, was simple: leave nothing behind that could shelter advancing Soviet forces during the Arctic winter. The policy was executed with ruthless consistency. Beginning in October, German units torched Kirkenes, then moved along the coast toward Hammerfest and Alta, leaving little but stone chimneys and burned earth behind. Houses were wired with explosives. Fishing huts, trading posts, and storage sheds were set alight. Bridges blown apart fell into freezing rivers, and telegraph lines collapsed in tangled heaps of burned timber and wire. By early 1945, more than 70% of all buildings in Finnmark had disappeared in smoke. Within this devastation, Sami communities faced a different kind of loss. Their lives were tied more to land than to towns, yet the burning reached deep into their wintering grounds. Cabins used during migration, small goati of wood and turf, were destroyed as readily as larger Norwegian homes. Boats that herders relied on for river crossings or coastal fishing were seized or burned. Even corrals and fences, humble constructions of birch and spruce, were not spared. For families who depended on reindeer to move, eat, and earn, losing these structures was as crippling as losing a village. The retreat was accompanied by forced evacuations. German soldiers rounded up civilians and loaded them onto naval craft, moving south toward Tromsø. Others were marched overland, often without knowing if they would ever see their homes again. Families were separated in the confusion. Children boarded vessels ahead of parents. Elders waited for days before receiving orders to move. Reindeer herds, unable to travel under armed escort, were left behind on the tundra. Archival accounts later described herds scattering as gunfire and explosions echoed across the plateau. Some reindeer were driven off migration routes entirely, wandering into valleys where they would not be found for months. As October turned into November, the destruction reached its peak. Hammerfest, once a bustling Arctic port, was reduced to blackened foundations in a matter of days. Entire neighborhoods vanished in a single week. Smoke drifted across the fjords, mixing with early winter fog. Even the land seemed bruised. Scorched earth replaced brushwood, and hillsides that had once been dotted with Sami tents and seasonal huts stood stripped and barren. In the middle of this devastation, rumors spread that the retreating army intended to burn every settlement north of the Lichen line. Many civilians refused to believe it. Others watched the flames approaching and fled at the last possible moment, hoping to rescue belongings. Those who left found themselves on overcrowded boats, shivering in the Arctic wind, clutching whatever they could carry. For Sami families, what they could carry mattered little compared to what they could not. The reindeer herds that had sustained their communities for generations. In Tromsø and other temporary stopovers, evacuees arrived exhausted, silent, and uncertain. They had no clear sense of how long the exile would last. Some feared they would never return at all. For many, the shock lay not only in what they had lost, but in how quickly it had disappeared. A lifetime's work could be undone in a single night of burning. Fishing equipment tenaciously crafted by hand vanished in minutes. A goati that had sheltered 2 or 3 generations burned down before dawn. Even the landscape felt unstable. Paths, once marked by familiar huts, were now unrecognizable stretches of ash and ice. When German forces finally withdrew toward the end of April 1945, the region they left behind was unlike any other in Europe. The Scorched Earth retreat had not been a random act of brutality, but an organized dismantling of life. In many places, There was no distinction between military targets and ordinary dwellings. Everything that could be burned was. As liberation approached and German troops left the area entirely, the silence returned, but now it felt ominous, heavy with the sense that something had been erased. When civilians began returning after the war ended in May, they walked into a landscape transformed beyond expectation. Reports from the time describe people standing among the remains of their homes, unable to recognize their own villages, without buildings, without boats, without bridges. The coastline was no longer a series of communities, but a string of ruins. Sami families returning to their migration routes found empty clearings where cabins had stood, and vast distances where once there had been familiar shelters. Reindeer herds, scattered months earlier, had wandered into unfamiliar ranges. Some survived, many did not. The devastation was visible everywhere, but the more serious damage lay beneath the surface. The land itself had been changed. Burned vegetation, weakened grazing grounds, explosive craters scarred riverbanks essential for seasonal crossings. Even the soil smelled of ash. What people found in 1945 was not the same homeland they had left, and as they tried to imagine how to rebuild, one realization became clear. The hardest part of returning was not the absence of buildings. It was discovering how profoundly the land had been altered, and how uncertain the future now looked. A people tied to land, but now barred from entering it. Liberation reached Northern Norway in May 1945 with an air of relief. But the relief did not last long. As families stepped off boats or crossed mountain passes toward what had once been home, they were met not only by ruins, but by roadblocks, patrols, and government orders, telling them to turn back. The region north of the Lichen line, most of Finnmark and parts of Tromsø, was declared off-limits. It was too dangerous, authorities said. Mines everywhere, destroyed bridges, no food stores, no shelter. Even the smallest settlement had been stripped of its winter supplies. Officials warned that returning now might lead to starvation long before reconstruction could begin. The ban was meant to be temporary, a measure until basic safety and shelter could be ensured. But for people who had already endured forced evacuation just months earlier, the message was crushing. After months in overcrowded barns, borrowed rooms, and hastily built barracks farther south, many evacuees believed that returning home, no matter the condition, would give them a sense of control. Instead, they were told that home was still out of reach. For the Sami, the restriction cut even deeper. Their lives did not revolve around fixed streets or towns, but around movement, seasonal migrations shaped by terrain, weather, and ancient routes linking winter and summer pastures. To be told they could not return to the land meant more than inconvenience. It meant breaking the pattern that held communities together. Families who had spent generations moving between the same valleys now faced something unprecedented, a winter without returning to their own grazing grounds. Many Sami herders tried to wait out the order in makeshift shelters. Some stayed in barns offered by Norwegian farmers. Others erected lavu tents on open ground, using whatever poles and canvas they had managed to save during evacuation. Entire families spent the first post-war months living in spaces never meant for long-term habitation. Barn lofts crowded with smoke from simple stoves, fishing sheds converted into temporary homes, and tents struck by Arctic winds that carried sand and ash from the burned north. Overcrowding strained relations in some southern districts. The arrival of thousands of evacuees created pressure on local food supplies, fishing grounds, and work. Sami communities were often moved again, from one temporary location to another, as local councils tried to distribute the population. Children found themselves attending unfamiliar schools. Reindeer herders struggled to locate grazing land for animals that had survived the winter. Many herds had been depleted or scattered months earlier, and those still intact needed space. The government insisted could not yet be accessed. Despite official orders, some Sami families set out for the north regardless. They travelled quietly, avoiding main roads, using mountain passes and river valleys they knew from herding. Their purpose was simple: to find surviving reindeer. Herds left behind during the German retreat had roamed unsupervised for months. Some had drifted onto Russian or Finnish land. Others had moved into burned terrain where food was scarce. If not found soon, they risked dying before the next winter. For herders who lived by the animals' movements, waiting for government permission was unthinkable. These quiet return journeys did not always end well. People reached their wintering cabins only to find foundations still warm from the fires months earlier. Others discovered mine warning signs or debris left by retreating soldiers, but even with the danger, many refused to leave again. They built lean-tos against surviving chimney stones, slept in makeshift shelters beneath burned rafters, and lit fires in the open to warm the cold ground. Their determination came not from defying authority for its own sake, but from the knowledge that reindeer herding could not be paused. Migration cycles did not wait for administrative decisions. By late summer 1945, pressure from evacuees began forcing the government to reconsider its restrictions. Reports from the region confirmed that people were returning on their own, and that keeping them away would only force them to take more dangerous journeys. Eventually, gradually, the ban north of Lichen began to loosen, but by then, the damage of displacement had already taken root. Whole cedar groups, family-based herding communities had been fractured. Some families returned months before others. Some never found the remnants of their herds at all. Others discovered that the grazing lands they depended on had been transformed by fire. Even where mines were cleared and paths reopened, the experience of exile left scars. Seasonal rhythms had been disrupted. Children who had spent the winter in unfamiliar towns struggled to readjust to the quiet of the tundra. Elders, whose memories anchored migration routes, were forced to adapt to a landscape whose familiar markers had been erased. And across the north, improvised shelters became the first homes families returned to, as they waited for reconstruction crews to arrive, crews already stretched thin by the scale of the devastation. Yet amid hardship, there were acts of endurance. Communities shared survival tools. Families rebuilt temporary corrals together. People passed news about which herds had been sighted, where grazing was possible, and which river crossings were still intact. Slowly, the sense of being displaced in their own homeland gave way to a determination to reclaim it one valley, one hut, one herd at a time. But the real challenge was yet to come. The government's promise of reconstruction would arrive soon enough, but it carried its own complications. Standardized buildings, rigid housing plans, and decisions made far from the tundra. And as Sami families prepared to rebuild, they began to realize that returning home was one thing, but rebuilding a life on burned ground would test them in ways they had never faced before. When everything is ash, where do you begin? When the restrictions north of the Lichen line finally began to ease in late 1945, the first wave of returnees stepped into a silence that felt both familiar and foreign. They were back on their own land at last, but the ground beneath their feet was no longer the one they had known. Where houses once stood, there were only stone foundations. Where trading huts lined the coastline, only twisted nails and fragments of charred planks remained. For Sami families who had moved across these landscapes seasonally, the sight was more than unsettling, it was disorienting. Landmarks that guided migration had vanished, and the structures that marked family presence had turned into ash. The Norwegian Directorate for Reconstruction arrived soon after, tasked with restoring an entire region, almost from scratch. Their engineers and assessors fanned out across Finnmark and northern Tromsø, mapping what had survived and what had been lost. The reports they sent back were almost monotonous in their devastation. Total loss. No salvageable material. Complete destruction. By this point, more than 55,000 people had been displaced, and even the largest towns had been razed to the ground. The operation ahead was immense. The Directorate's first response was speed. Temporary shelters, barracks, and simple wooden huts were assembled in cluster after cluster. These structures offered walls and roofs, but little more. They were draft-swept, thin-walled, and cramped, and they did not align with the needs of families who had lived in free movement rather than fixed dwellings. Still, they were sheltered, and that counted for something as winter returned. But for Sami communities, the standardized barracks created an immediate tension. Reindeer herding required flexibility, homes that could be dismantled, rebuilt, or moved as needed. Prefabricated houses, designed for stationary living, could not easily follow migration routes. They anchored families in one place precisely when their work demanded seasonal travel. For herders accustomed to Gogati and Lavu, the new structures were not simply foreign, they were impractical. Some tried to adapt the prefab houses anyway, using them as winter bases while rebuilding traditional structures nearby. Others lived in the barracks only long enough to gather the materials needed to construct shelters more suited to life on the move. Birch poles were cut again from surviving groves. Blocks of turf were shaped and layered for insulation. Families scavenged what little timber remained from burned ruins, transforming fragments of destruction into the frames of new huts. Another major problem emerged quickly: boats. Coastal Sami and Norwegian families relied on them not just for food but for movement. Boats had been burned during the retreat, smashed on rocks, or confiscated. Without them, fishing grounds could not be reached. River crossings became perilous, and migration routes broke down entirely. While the state promised replacements, deliveries were slow and materials were scarce. For months, some families relied on makeshift rafts lashed together from driftwood and salvaged beams. Compensation was supposed to help with such losses. But early methods underestimated the value of indigenous tools and livestock. A reindeer was assessed as if it were merely property, not the central unit of a family's livelihood. A handcrafted boat, built to manage specific fjord currents, was valued as if it were interchangeable with any generic vessel. And the reimbursement for a burned gawati often failed to capture the labor and the cultural knowledge embedded in its construction. The directorate's priorities were clear: rebuild towns first, major infrastructure second, scattered seasonal structures last. But for Sami communities, the scattered buildings were not marginal, they were home. Winter huts along river valleys, corrals in remote forests, and migration fences on open plateaus formed the backbone of herding life. Without them, movement became unpredictable, and unpredictability threatened both people and animals. Every day, the landscape itself reminded families of how far they still had to go. Burned soil held heat differently. Meltwater pooled in unusual places where vegetation had been destroyed. Ash thickened the air during dry spells, settling into clothing and fur. Paths once marked by fences were now open fields. Even where families rebuilt, the land seemed unstable, unsure of how to reshape itself after months of burning and explosions. And yet, life was returning. Smoke from new stoves rose where old chimneys had collapsed. Corrals formed again as families gathered spare timber and lashed together what they could. Lavu tents appeared in the valleys as herders followed the surviving reindeer, guiding them away from mined areas and into safer grazing grounds. In some places, families rebuilt their gawati directly on the old foundations, treating the burned stones as anchors rather than reminders of loss. Amid these efforts, the directorate expanded its plans. Permanent houses would come later, they said. Roads, harbours, and schools would be restored in phases. But for many Sami families, these promises felt distant. They needed tools, boats, hay barns, and migration infrastructure immediately, not years from now. Even as they accepted state assistance, they relied most heavily on one another, sharing nails, poles, hides, ropes, and labor. Reconstruction for them was not a centralized process, but a communal one. As 1946 and 1947 passed, the burn scars remained visible everywhere, but life began to reorganize itself around them. Families learned which valleys still held safe grazing, which riverbanks were stable, and which trails had been altered by the fires. Slowly, the rhythms that defined Sami life movement gathering, herding, rebuilding, began to take shape again. But beneath their progress lay a growing realization. The greatest obstacle they faced was not the loss of buildings or tools. It was something deeper, something harder to measure. The land itself had been altered, its vegetation, its riverbeds, its patterns of snow and wind. And as Sami families settled into their first years back home, they began to understand that rebuilding structures was only the first step. The real challenge would be learning how to live in a landscape that no longer behaves as it once had. The war scarred not just towns but the ecosystem itself. When Sami families finally re-established their first shelters and resumed cautious movement across the tundra in 1946, they quickly discovered that the destruction they had witnessed above ground was only part of the story. Beneath the ash and silence, the land itself had shifted in ways they had never seen before. Fire had a long memory, and in the Arctic, where regeneration is slow, that memory would shape every step taken in the years ahead. One of the first signs was the grazing land. Before the burning, reindeer fed on lichen that grew in thick, pale carpets across rocky slopes and forest floors. After the Scorched Earth retreat, those carpets were gone. The fires had burned hot enough to destroy the delicate layers that took decades to form. What little lichen remained was brittle, blackened, or buried beneath soil loosened by explosions. Archival ecological reports from the late 1940s noted that full regrowth could take 20 years or more, and even then, the quality might not match what had been lost. With grazing grounds weakened, herds wandered farther in search of food. Some moved into steep ravines they had never used before. Others attempted dangerously close to minefields or debris piles left by retreating German units. The shifting patterns created new challenges for herders, who relied not only on tradition but on the land's predictable behavior. Now, the predictable had become uncertain. Riverbanks showed another kind of wound. Explosives had torn into both sand and rock, changing currents and collapsing edges. Seasonal crossings, once routine points where reindeer entered shallow water in large, orderly groups, became treacherous. Some banks had eroded into steep drops. Others had filled with debris, redirecting flows into deeper channels. Herders described reindeer hesitating at crossings they had used all their lives, pausing at edges that no longer matched the memory passed down through generations. And scattered across these altered landscapes lay abandoned military material. Rusted wire snagged reindeer antlers. Metal shards from destroyed vehicles protruded from moss-covered ground. Ammunition boxes, half buried, blended into the terrain. Mine-clearing teams worked across Finnmark and Tromsø between 1945 and 1947, but they could not reach every valley, every ridge, every migration corridor. Even years later, herders spoke of avoiding particular hollows or slopes, not because of old stories, but because of the lingering possibility of danger beneath the soil. Then there was the winter. The first post-war winters were harsh by any measure, but what made them devastating was the absence of shelter. Winter cabins, goati, and storage sheds had been deliberately destroyed to prevent Soviet forces from using them. Now, with the land stripped bare, reindeer were exposed to storms they had once weathered in the protection of timber stands or low-lying huts. Families, too, struggled against conditions that felt colder simply because nothing remained to break the wind. Archival notes recorded reindeer loss during these winters at levels far higher than before the war, though exact figures vary. Some herds perished when ice crusted over the feeding grounds, preventing them from reaching what little lichen remained. Others suffered as migration routes stretched longer and required more energy than weakened animals could sustain. Despite these challenges, Sami communities adapted with remarkable resilience. They studied the burn patterns, noting where new grass sprouted in the ash-rich soil and where lichen showed the first signs of recovery. They shifted migration paths to safer, more fertile ground, even if it meant altering routes that had been used for centuries. New corrals were built farther south in temporary locations. Families cooperated to clear debris from riverbanks, moving logs, stones, and rusted metal by hand. In places where a gowati had once stood, a lavu took its place, lighter, movable, and easier to rebuild if conditions changed again. There was also innovation. Some herders experimented with new grazing rhythms, adjusting the timing of seasonal movement to match the slow return of vegetation. Others worked with local administrators to map areas still suspected of containing mines, creating informal safety corridors for migration. Families tracked which valleys recovered faster and shared this knowledge across Sieda groups. These adaptations did not erase the difficulty, but they allowed life to continue in a landscape that had, in many ways, forgotten its old patterns. Yet, even as communities rebuilt their routines, the deeper scars remained. The land's changes also shifted relationships between people. Some families relocated permanently because their old wintering grounds were no longer viable. Others divided their herds to reduce pressure on weakened grazing. Decisions once guided by inherited knowledge now depended on improvisation and experimentation, creating both tension and cooperation between groups. The landscape's uncertainty became a shared challenge, binding communities together in new ways, while erasing some of the old boundaries that once defined them. As the late 1940s drew on, small signs of recovery began to appear. Fragile lichen patches emerged in sheltered places untouched by the fiercest flames. River crossings stabilized as vegetation slowly reclaimed damaged banks. Paths once blocked by debris widened through repeated use, marked again by the steady movement of animals. These were changes measured in inches, not miles, but they mattered. Each sign of regrowth carried the promise that a scorched land could still support the life intertwined with it. But for all this progress, reconstruction demanded a new kind of balance. Tradition had guided generations, but now the land required adaptation, flexibility, and choices that older rhythms did not always anticipate. As Sami communities rebuilt their herding infrastructure, they found themselves caught between the old ways that defined their identity and the new realities imposed by war and environmental loss. And with those realities came a growing realization. The challenges ahead would not be solved by rebuilding structures alone. They would require repairing something less real, yet equally vital: the cultural life that connected people to the land long before it had been burned. Rebuilding homes was one challenge. Rebuilding cultural life was another. As the late 1940s unfolded, the physical contours of Northern Norway and Lapland began, slowly and unevenly, to recover. But beneath the visible reconstruction lay a quieter, more fragile effort, restoring the cultural fabric that had held Sami communities together long before war and fire tore through their homelands. The destruction of cabins, fences, and boats was devastating, but these were things that could be rebuilt with timber, patience, and labor. The loss of cultural artifacts, objects of memory, skill, and lineage was harder to replace. Many of these losses were discovered only after returning. In several districts, parish records, household inventories, and community archives had burned with the buildings that held them. Family drums, carved tools, and handcrafted objects passed down through generations had vanished. For Sami communities, where history was often preserved through both oral tradition and material culture, these absences left gaps not just in belongings, but in the continuity of identity. The rebuilding process unfolded under the framework of Norwegian administration. Reconstruction committees arrived with forms, assessments, and standardized plans. Language barriers added to the strain. Many families had to navigate documentation written in Norwegian, even when their own daily language was Sami. The process felt impersonal at times, an unavoidable consequence of a state trying to rebuild an entire region, yet one that added to the sense of cultural fragility in the post-war years. Children felt these pressures as well. During displacement, many had attended southern schools. When families returned north, some found that post-war shortages led administrators to keep certain schools closed for extended periods. For practical reasons, children were sent south again, far from their families, immersing them in languages and customs not their own. Though the intention was educational continuity, the result was an extended separation from the cultural rhythms of home. Some children returned with diminished fluency in the Sami languages, a shift that elders viewed with quiet concern. And yet, even within these constraints, communities worked to restore what could be revived. The act of rebuilding a goati became more than constructing a shelter. It became a symbol of re-establishing presence on the land. Families gathered birch poles, layered turf, and shaped earthen walls, not just for warmth, but as a reaffirmation of continuity. In some valleys, several families cooperated to build a row of huts, reviving patterns of shared labor that had defined life before the war. Cooperative efforts extended to herding as well. With many corrals destroyed and timber scarce, families pooled materials. Makeshift enclosures were built where older structures once stood, using salvaged planks and freshly cut saplings. These cooperative corrals helped stabilize herds during the early post-war years, preventing further losses, while lichen fields recovered. They also reinforced the social bonds that tied cedar groups together, strengthening networks that had been strained by evacuation and displacement. At the same time, tensions emerged over land rights and boundaries. As the state surveyed northern territories to guide rebuilding, officials relied on maps that sometimes clashed with the oral boundaries remembered by Sami families. Routes that had long been used for migration were redrawn without full awareness of their traditional significance. Some grazing districts were recorded differently than before, creating disputes that would echo long after the immediate post-war years. Families found themselves explaining that certain areas had been used for generations, even if they had never been drawn precisely on pre-war maps. These challenges did not break the cultural life of the Sami, but they reshaped it. Storytelling gained new importance as families recounted what had been lost and why. Elders reminded younger generations of roots, stories, and customs that risked fading during the years of upheaval. In some communities, evenings in rebuilt goati were devoted to retelling histories and reinforcing the knowledge that formal records could no longer provide. Food traditions, too, became a point of continuity. Smoking fish, drying meat, and preparing dishes tied to seasonal cycles helped restore rhythms that the war had disrupted. Even when equipment was scarce, communities adapted. Metal salvaged from wreckage was hammered into knives. Abandoned military canvas was sewn into bags. Objects that once symbolized occupation became tools for rebuilding culture. Religious and communal spaces followed the same pattern. Local churches, often the centers of both spiritual and social life, had been destroyed or damaged. Rebuilding them became a communal priority. In some districts, church bells were recast from metal recovered from ruins. In others, services were held in tents until a new structure could be built. For Sami communities, some of whom held dual traditions blending Christian practice with Indigenous identity, these spaces offered a grounding sense of continuity after years of displacement. Yet, despite these signs of renewal, the cultural reconstruction had limits. The war had taken more than buildings, it had interrupted knowledge transfer. Some elders had died during evacuation. Others returned to find that the places connected to their memories no longer existed. And without certain structures, boats, corrals, archives, some practices had to be relearned from scratch or adapted in ways that subtly altered their meaning. Still, the persistence of cultural life was undeniable. Despite the trauma of scorched earth and forced exile, Sami communities demonstrated a resilience shaped by centuries of adapting to a harsh northern environment. The burned land did not erase their presence. It challenged it, certainly, but it also inspired new forms of cooperation, new expressions of identity, and renewed ties between families. But as the 1950s approached, reconstruction efforts moved into a new phase. More permanent policies, regulations, and compensation systems were drafted in government offices far from the tundra. And while communities rebuilt what they could with their own hands, The future of Sami land use and the balance between tradition and modernization was increasingly shaped by decisions beyond their control. What came next would test not just cultural endurance, but the place of Sami voices in shaping the future of their re-emerging homeland. Who gets to define how a homeland is rebuilt? By the late 1940s, the physical work of reconstruction was well underway. Barracks had given way to more permanent homes in some districts, boats were returning to the water, and roads slowly emerged from the destruction. But as the visible landscape changed, another struggle unfolded, one less dramatic to the eye, yet equally decisive. It centered on policy, rights, and the question that hovered over every rebuilding effort. Who had the authority to shape the future of Sami lands after the war? As compensation programs expanded, these questions became unavoidable. Families filed claims for burned goati, destroyed corrals, lost reindeer, and stolen tools. But the process was far from straightforward. Early compensation rulings varied widely between districts. A reindeer in one area might be valued differently than the same animal in another. The loss of a winter hut might be compensated as if it were a simple shelter, without regard for its cultural or practical importance in migration cycles. For Sami families who depended on these structures for survival, such assessments felt like partial acknowledgements of what had been lost. Sami representatives began pushing for broader interpretations, compensation not just for property, but for loss of use. If a grazing area had been burned to the point of unusability, the impact extended far beyond the value of the land itself. It disrupted movement for years, endangered herds, and weakened community ties. These arguments slowly gained traction, but the process was slow, shaped by meetings, letters, and committees whose members often lived far from the regions they governed. At the same time, the Norwegian state continued its post-war modernization drive. Engineers planned new roads to connect isolated hamlets. Housing planners proposed standardized structures suited to a modern welfare society. These plans carried benefits: greater access, better transport, more reliable communication, but they also posed risks. Roads built across migration routes could interrupt reindeer movement. Fixed housing allocations did not always align with seasonal patterns of land use. In some cases, families found themselves encouraged to settle more permanently, a shift that threatened the mobility central to their traditions. Within this tension, Sami's voice gradually gained firmer ground. Local reconstruction committees, initially dominated by regional administrators, began to include Sami elders and herders who offered insights into seasonal routes and land use patterns. Their presence often reshaped discussions. Plans for new roads were redrawn to avoid critical grazing areas. Proposed settlement zones were modified after testimony revealed their significance for herding. Though these adjustments did not resolve all conflicts, they demonstrated a slowly growing recognition. Rebuilding the North required more than measurements and blueprints. It required listening. National awareness also began to shift. Journalists traveling through Finnmark and Tromsø reported on the distinctive losses faced by Sami communities, highlighting not only the burned towns but the damage to reindeer husbandry. Articles published in the early 1950s noted that rebuilding had to consider indigenous livelihoods, interwoven with landscape, a phrase that captured the essence of what bureaucratic documents often overlooked. These reports helped broaden public understanding of why standardized approaches fell short. Yet even as recognition grew, the policy landscape remained uneven. Some districts implemented forward-looking compensation schemes. Others struggled to fund even basic replacements. Reindeer husbandry regulations drafted in the early 1950s marked an important step, setting guidelines for herd management, land usage, and community rights. But they also introduced new layers of administration. Families needed permits, documentation, and compliance with rules that sometimes clashed with customary practice. Still, for many Sami leaders, these regulations represented both a challenge and an opportunity. On the one hand, they introduced constraints, On the other hand, they provided an official framework that acknowledged herding not as a relic of the past, but as a legitimate livelihood requiring protection and structure. In a post-war society increasingly oriented toward modernization, this acknowledgement mattered. Amid these policy shifts, Sami communities continued to adapt. Some families advocated for collective decision-making within cedar groups, strengthening the internal governance systems that predated state administration. Others worked to formalize their rights through documentation mapping migration routes, recording seasonal patterns, and articulating their needs in terms state officials could understand. This process often required bridging cultural differences. Where state administration favored written reports, Sami knowledge had typically been transmitted orally. Converting generations of lived experience into text was demanding, yet many recognized it as necessary for securing their place in rebuilding plans. As the decade drew to a close, the question of recognition, legal, cultural, and practical, came into sharper focus. The trauma of Scorched Earth had not only wiped out buildings and tools, it had forced the state to confront the reality that the far north was not an empty land waiting to be rebuilt, but a lived landscape shaped by generations of indigenous presence. Whether policies acknowledged that reality determined how effectively Sami families could rebuild, by the early 1950s, progress was visible, but incomplete. Compensation had improved, but it had not fully captured the depth of the loss. New regulations existed, but were still being implemented. Reconstruction committees were more inclusive, but land disputes persisted. The Sami were heard more than before the war, yet they were still often on the margins of decision-making. What endured, however, was the determination of communities to hold their ground, literally and symbolically. The Scorched Earth had challenged their presence, but not erased it, and as reconstruction entered its final phases, one truth became increasingly evident. The long-term legacy of the war would be measured not only in rebuilt houses and roads, but in how Sami society carried its stories, rights, and identity into the decades beyond. Ahead lay a final chapter, one shaped by memory, resilience, and the changing face of the North as time moved on. The war ended, but its footprints never fully disappeared. By the 1950s, Northern Norway and the borderlands of Finnish Lapland no longer resembled the wasteland that liberation troops had first encountered in 1945. Houses rose where nothing but chimneys had stood. Roads cut new lines across tundra and forest. Harbours revived with the sound of engines and nets hitting saltwater again. Yet beneath this new surface lay a quiet truth. The region had not simply recovered, it had been reshaped. The Scorched Earth campaign had left marks not only on the terrain, but on the memories and identities of those who lived there. These marks could not be paved over or rebuilt with timber. For Sami families, the return to familiar landscapes carried a sense of triumph, but also reflection. They had survived the firestorm and the dislocation that followed. They had rebuilt goati, repaired corrals, and restored migration paths. But many understood that something more profound had changed. Stories told around evening fires spoke of nights spent in borrowed barns, of long treks south during evacuation, of returning to ash-strewn valleys where nothing remained. These stories became part of a collective memory, intertwined with older tales of seasonal movement and ancestral resilience. In some communities, elders began to see the reconstruction years as a dividing line. Before the war, migration routes followed patterns shaped by long familiarity. After the war, those routes adapted to new conditions, ravaged grazing lands, recovering lichen fields, and altered river crossings. What emerged was a hybrid landscape, navigated with both inherited knowledge and the hard lessons learned in the late 1940s. Children born after the war grew up hearing about places that existed only in memory, replaced now by new clearings, new huts, and new paths. Rebuilding symbolic communal spaces became a key part of this transition. Churches destroyed in 1944 and 1945 were among the first structures that communities prioritized rebuilding. Though many Sami balanced Christian practice with indigenous traditions, the rebuilding of churches carried significance beyond religion. It signaled continuity, that despite fire and displacement, communities could reclaim sacred gathering points. In some districts, fishing stations were rebuilt with a similar intent. These places served not just economic needs, but cultural ones, offering sites where families met, shared news, and revived rituals tied to the rhythm of sea and land. As the physical world regained shape, the natural world slowly followed. Lichen, though slow to return, began spreading in small patches across the tundra. Riverbanks stabilized with new vegetation. Hillsides that had once been stripped bare showed early signs of regrowth. For herders observing these changes, these were not simply ecological events. They were signs that the land itself was healing. The regrowth, however limited, helped restore the seasonal confidence necessary for reindeer herding to flourish once again. But history in the north is never only natural, it is political as well. The memory of the war years influenced later debates about land rights, grazing boundaries, and Sami identity. As Norway modernized, conversations about indigenous representation became more relevant. The experience of being displaced and then rebuilding from near-total destruction became part of how Sami communities articulated their claims to land and heritage. It also framed national discussions about recognition, rights, and cultural preservation. The Reconstruction era, the hardship, cooperation, and resilience formed a powerful narrative thread that stretched into the later decades of the 20th century. Intergenerational effects became clearer as time passed. Children who had grown up in temporary housing or southern boarding schools often held different views on modernization than their elders. Some embraced new opportunities. Others feared the erosion of traditions that had already been tested by war and its aftermath. This blend of perspectives shaped the evolving identity of Sami society. While some practices shifted with time, the core values connection to land, seasonal movement, communal responsibility persisted, strengthened in part by the collective experience of rebuilding. In the modern era, recognition of the Scorched Earth devastation expanded within Norwegian national memory. Memorials were erected in several towns, marking sites where people had been forced to flee and where homes once stood. Educational programs highlighted the particular suffering of Finnmark, often described as the most devastated region of World War II in Norway. Exhibitions in museums, including Sami cultural institutions, displayed fragments of burned tools and reindeer herding equipment, and photographs taken after liberation images in which the horizon was dominated by ruins. For many Sami families who visited these memorials or contributed their stories to archives, the experience carried weight. It acknowledged something long felt, that the losses of 1944 through 1945 were not just economic or structural, but cultural. The rebuilding that followed required more than physical labor. It demanded the renewal of identity, community, and tradition in a land scarred to its foundations. Yet the story does not end with loss. It also holds resilience. Sami communities reclaimed their land not through dramatic gestures, but through thousands of quiet acts, planting poles for new goati, gathering reindeer over charred fields, teaching children the names of places whose landmarks had burned away. These acts reaffirmed belonging in a region that had once been emptied, intended to keep armies out and leave no shelter behind. In the decades since, Northern Norway has changed again. Modern roads, phones, schools, and industries reaching deep into areas once accessible only by sledge or foot. But even in a modern landscape, echoes of the Reconstruction years remain. They appear in decisions about land use, in debates over grazing rights, and in the cultural revival movements that draw strength from enduring traditions. The memory of the Scorched Earth is woven into these conversations, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. The war tried to erase a way of life by burning the land beneath it. The aftermath proved that the land still carried its people. Sami families rebuilt more than their homes, they rebuilt continuity, shaping a future in a region once meant to be left empty. Their presence stands as one of the quiet legacies of the post-war North, a testament to endurance in a landscape forever changed. And as the North continues to evolve, that legacy asks one final, quiet question. What does it mean to rebuild not just from destruction, but alongside the memory of what once was and what endured? If stories like this help illuminate the overlooked corners of World War II, consider supporting the channel. Like, share, and subscribe to help bring more of these untold histories to light.